Good afternoon. Welcome to the Sioux Falls City Council informational meeting, first one of 2014. Welcome to everybody here in Carnegie and those that may be watching on CityLink. We welcome you, and we have a fairly short informational agenda, one item this afternoon, but I'd like to start with our City Council open discussion. Does anybody have anything they'd like to bring to the table for the rest of the council? Apparently not, so we will head right into our agenda. Today we have representing our audit department, Rich Oaksel, the internal audit manager, and we have a presentation on, I believe there's 2 audits that were completed. So, Mr. Oaksel, the floor is yours.
Okay, very good. I'll start with the shorter report, a very short report on the investment policy. And what this is how we invest the city's idle funds. We're not talking about the pension funds. That's sort of like a separate bucket of money with the different investment purposes. But this is the cash that the city has that's idle for at least for a short time. And what do we do with that money? And as of June 30th of last year, we had about $27 million that we had in local banks as time deposits, and we had about $111 million in government securities. And the finance department handles the investment of these funds and moving that money around so that we can pay our bills when they come due. But there's a investment advisory board that's appointed by the mayor with the council's consent, 5 citizen members who review the policy from time to time. They meet at least quarterly, and these are experts in finance and provide very good advice to us on how we can best invest our idle cash. All the money of the city is pooled. Back in the old days, decades ago, you would actually have separate checking accounts, say for different city departments. But right now, all the money goes into one pooled account so that we get the maximum investment advantage from that. So, the results, our review of the policy and the process that the city goes through, we found that the current investment policy is in compliance with the state of South Dakota codified law, except that there's some references to some repealed or transferred statutes, so the policy needs to be updated to reflect those to remove those repealed references. And we found that there was no written procedures, which is required by that investment policy. So that led to our 2 recommendations that the investment policy should be reviewed and updated, which finance agreed with as soon as the investment advisory board has done the review. And we also recommend that they have written procedures in place, which they agreed to. So upon completion of a revised policy, which I think was, the last time it was revised was 2000, so it's been 13 years. So as soon as the new policy is updated and the obsolete references to South Dakota law are removed, and the new financial software is implemented, which is happening this week. We're going live with the new software. Then they'll have the new written procedures in place. So we found the internal controls were working as we would expect. The city's money was not at risk. The advisory board is doing a great job of providing professional advice and meeting regularly. So overall, a very good audit. So if there's any questions, I'm here. Tracy Turbeck is here, the finance director. So.
Questions on this agenda item? Seeing none?
Yeah.
Councilor Rolfing?
What kind of, we're talking a fairly substantial amount of money here.
Yes.
What kind of return are we getting? I know it's money market. Are we getting a 0.5% or?
I think we're doing a little better than that. Tracy, you want to?
Tell me 8. Tell me 8, Tracy,
it's
please.
Not 8%, I tell you that.
Darn.
Good afternoon, Tracy Turback with the Finance Office. You probably don't want me to tell you 8 because that would mean we're into something we shouldn't be in, probably, if we're getting that kind of a return. But rates are, as you know, historically very, very low, and particularly on the short end of the yield curve, which is where we would tend to be with most of our investments. We don't go out for long-term investments with our pooled cash. So rates are very, very low. The longest I think we've been going out here recently is out as far as 3 years. Most of it is much shorter than that. Excuse me, and we're looking at under a 1% return for those investments.
Okay. Thank you.
Any others? If I could, Rich, does the advisory board do they elect like their own chair of that board? How does that work? Do you know how that board is consisted? Has it been much turnover on it?
From what I can see, there hasn't been a lot of turnover. When I went to one of the meetings at our closing conference, they just were welcoming a new member. But I think some of the members have been there for quite a few years. Rich Lauer, I think, is one of them. I think some of you folks know about Rich. And so I don't think there's a lot of turnover on that. But some very highly qualified people that advise the city on that. So,
sounds good. Thank you. All righty. Our audit report on overtime.
okay, this is a little bit longer report, and we have a lot of graphs here just to make things easier to understand. But overtime of the city it's a major expense. Payroll is obviously a major expense, and when you're paying people time and a half for their labor, it's something that we need to control and monitor. And overall, the city is doing a very good job. We're governed by the federal law, the FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and also we have 3 agreements with our employees. About 3 out of 4 of our employees are eligible for membership or represented by one of 3 unions. We have the general employees, we have the police officers and sergeants, and then we have the Association of Firefighters. And those 3 agreements also govern how we administer the overtime, how we pay it, and what the rules are. So we looked at that as part of this audit. Each department is responsible for budgeting and monitoring the use of their overtime. However, there is some oversight from the HR department. Each payroll period, they run a report. They look at the, if you want to call them the frequent flyers, the people that get at least 25% or more of their base wage in overtime for that pay period. They're looking at that as an exception report, and then they're asking for information from the departments why that person would have that much overtime. Okay, the 2 biggest users, and that's what we looked at in this audit, because the previous year, I think in 2012, we looked at the fire department specifically and their overtime and how they were managing their overtime. We looked at the biggest users outside of fire, and the 2 biggest users are the police department and then public works, and within public works, we're talking about the street department. The police department, they're working a 24/7 type of work, and they're obviously going to have overtime with emergencies, with officers called in for court time, that sort of thing, or investigations by the detectives. Street departments is going to be governed by snow events, and then when we have events like the ice storm last April, so they're going to be using a lot of overtime. A lot of time it's weather dependent. You can see for the last, I think, 5 years there, the blue bar there is what was budgeted, and the red bar is what was actually spent. So 4 out of the 5 years, we did not spend what we had budgeted for overtime, except with the exception of that middle was 2011. And the reason for that was because I think that was the flooding at Dakota Dunes, and a lot of that money was for fire personnel to go down to Dakota Dunes and help with the flood control efforts that summer. That money, a lot of it was reimbursed to the city by FEMA, so we got that money. We spent the money, say, in July, August, then we got the money back later. So that kind of spiked that year on that 5-year trend there.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Rich. Jim, do you mind scrolling through this so people that are watching online or CityLink can get a better idea of what's going on? Thanks.
Yeah, so if you can. Yeah. Obviously, in 2013, we had Operation Timber Strike, and the other thing that we also had, which would increase the overtime, was police saturation patrols. That was money that the police were able to do saturation patrols, but they received grant money to pay for the cost of the officers. So, and then Operation Timber Strike, we're going to get some of that money, or a lot of that money, reimbursed by the federal government. So there's just things that come up that can spike one year's budget, but typically we're getting reimbursed for that. You can keep going. Let's go to page 6 there, the results. We found that the internal controls were functioning as designed, and that overtime entries that we tested were approved timely by the appropriate supervisory personnel. However, we had one exception when we were looking at the police sergeants who are hourly employees. They were under the telestaff software. They were approving their own overtime. And I think this was simply an oversight. I don't think it was planned to be that way, but we didn't think it was a good idea for an hourly employee to be approving their own overtime. So hence that led to the one recommendation there on top of page 7. And we just made the recommendation that the police department modify their policy and procedures to require that an additional approval on hourly sergeant overtime request. We didn't find any abuse of overtime going on, but just thought that was not a good procedure. So the management response was they agreed with that. They'll no longer allow the sergeants to approve their own overtime. So if you look at the last page, or page 9, that's the 5-year trend. Overtime as a percentage of regular wages. And the goal of the city is to have overtime at about 3% or less when you compare it to the regular wages. We couldn't find any benchmark out there that says, well, a city should have no more than 3%, but that seems very low. I've looked at other reports from other cities, and sometimes they'll have 10% of their regular wages is in overtime. They have very high overtime costs. I think we're doing quite well. And if you look at that 5 years there, we're pretty much under that 3%, except for 2013. Way in that column on the right there, 2013 year to date, we were at 3.5. I think that was as of September, and that can be attributed to Operation Timber Strike. Primarily with the ice storm, we just had a lot of overtime. You can't budget for that. It just happens, and you have to deal with it. So overall, we're doing very, very well, and the departments are effectively managing their overtime. And we did run a list of, I think, like the top 10 or 20 users of overtime in the city, the individuals. And we just got a clarification from their manager or supervisor, why is this person there? We didn't have anybody that looked odd, why they would be on the top 20 list or the top 10. The explanations were very reasonable why the person would be there. We didn't find any evidence of people spiking their pension, for example, trying to get a lot of overtime right before they retire, which is a problem in other cities. We didn't find any evidence of that. And one reason is because the way the pension system is structured, it doesn't depend on your last year for how much your final average wage is. So it's not easy to do that. And we didn't find any abuses like that going on either. So is there any questions on this report?
Rich, you did a fantastic job, you and your staff, as always. We appreciate it. Very insightful. Thank you for the fantastic reports. That was our only agenda item for this meeting. Do we have any other business the council would like to discuss? Councilor Aguilar.
Mr. Chair, would you like to introduce our guests?
Yes, we have some Webelos from, I believe, I didn't get the pack, so somebody want to help me out there? Councilor Staggers, you probably know.
It's what?
So from St. Mary's School, we have a group of fourth graders, and we thank you for your interest, and I'm sure that there's a merit badge of some sort in the works for you for being here today, but it's just fantastic to see you, so thank you for taking the time to join us, so thank you. All righty. Thank you, Councilor Aguilar. What was the pack number? 159. Pack 159, okay. Just want that in the records. Thank you. Councilor Anderson Jr.
I'm not sure what our schedule is for the rest of this month, but I was going to request having Mark Cotter and the director of the street department come in and talk to us about snow removal this year, the positives and negatives that have happened so far this year.
Okay.
I've had a lot of people contact me and talk about our snow removal this year. I think it might be a good idea to.
And it's been an unusual year with 1 inch,
information.
2 inch snows. So we will get that scheduled. Jim David will take care of getting that scheduled for us. I'm sure we'll have time at an informational meeting to. Great idea for an update. Thank you. Anything else? Councilor Jameson.
I missed the first couple of minutes, so if Rex mentioned our task force meeting tomorrow, you didn't. Okay, we have a transit task force meeting tomorrow here at the overflow room at 3:30, and we're making some great headway, I believe, and a lot of cooperation is occurring. We're finally getting down to maybe some nitty-gritty of solving issues, but I know Councilor Aguilar was there at the first one, but Councilor Anderson, Councilor Rolfing, and myself are on that task force, and it's quite a sight. So if you've got time and available, tune in at 3:30. Stop by.
Okay. Thank you.
And I've got two other items, if I could. I'm sorry to miss the open discussion, but it must have gone pretty fast if I missed it. December 18th, we had a Metro Management Council meeting, which Jim Intiman and myself and Mayor are on. Just to give you a little heads up that they're doing very well over there. As you know, the funding changed with the state legislature and their actions. That's given great relief to the Metro Management. Their 2013 budget was very good. Their outlook for 2014 looks good too. They've got just normal turnover with other people and things happening, but their accreditation scores are high. Everything is going pretty good, and that funding is a big part of all that. It's been a while since we've been here, but that was on the 18th of December. And then as well, I wanted to bring up the issue of a work session for discussing the TIFs. We talked about that back in October when we made some minor revisions to the fees that are involved with the TIF, but I've certainly had a lot of discussions about it, and I think I've come to some realizations about what kind of language needs to be in it versus what I had proposed the first time. But I think Darren had offered to do a work session with us to even maybe go into it deeper. So I guess I'm just asking that we get that scheduled as well.
Would it be appropriate to do it as a work session or take it through one of our committees?
However, I'm willing to flow with it. However, Darren was the one who had mentioned a work session, so I'll do what body wants.
Councilor Erpenbach?
I just would add to that, to answer that question. We have run TIFs through Land Use Committee previously and had those smaller conversations and gone over and over and over TIFs. You know, if council really does want to dig into it again and some more, I would say it would be a work session.
You think a work session would be, okay, I'm seeing a lot of head nodding on having a work session.
But with the caveat being is it really something the entire council wants to dig into again? I mean, we've spent a lot of time with TIFs in the last 3 years. I just wonder where we're headed with it, you know.
Other comments or suggestions? Councilor Erpenbach brings up a good point. Is it something that we want to go into through a work session? That's kind of why I mentioned having it through a committee. It could probably be discussed and vetted a little bit better. A work session, are we going to be talking about specific language to ordinance? Is that what your idea is, Councilor Jameson?
Well, that's how the discussion started, were revisions and additions that I wanted to add to it. I think if there's other items, if there's a need for another work session, we could make it just a part of an agenda.
Let me ask, you're involved in the transit task force. How long do you think maybe that would be able to come? Because that's going to be a pretty involved process too.
Well, that's interesting. I suppose we could do an update that way, a more detailed update. But our intentions were to have the recommendations for the task force come in early spring in order to include them in the budget for 2015. So But that would be an item, certainly in discussion, that's, the taxi cab ordinance could be another one. I'll go with however you guys want to go. I'm not hung up on a work session, but.
Thoughts? Councilor Anderson?
Well, just as far as the taxi cab ordinance, the council will see that here in the very near future. I think that we're just about ready to move that forward. If any disagreements from, I think as a council, as
I think we could probably do
as
that
all
one.
four of us are sitting here, I think that, our discussion and the advancements that we've made in rewriting that ordinance is right there.
Councilor Urbanbach?
I would agree with Councilor Anderson on that that has been through work sessions of that task force, and that's something that's going to end up in an informational session and do a first, second reading. We'll have plenty of time to talk about it, and take action on it. I guess I would, back to the TIF issue, if we're talking about things to put on a work session, I love work sessions. I really appreciate us being able to have those kinds of conversations. I just would wonder how many of my colleagues on the council are really interested in digging into TIFs again. I mean, I'm only hearing Councilor Jameson and possibly Councilor Anderson today. I'm just wondering, is that something we're just nodding our heads because we do, or are we really interested in digging into this thing again? Because we've done it a lot. And the time that I've been on the council, we've looked at TIFs 3 or 4 times. I'm not sure what the issue is.
I guess that's why I'd like to see it go through the Land Use Committee. Councilor Rolfing?
I was just sitting back kind of listening, and I think I agree with what your conclusion there might be, that it might be good to run that through land use and have a discussion on some of the proposals that Councilor Jameson may have to make some changes and see what that committee feels like. And then if the entire council wants to get together on a work session at that point, once we know what's going on, then might be a more appropriate time to do it. Or if it just sails through land use right into the right onto the agenda, then we'd free up time we had in another work session to look at another topic.
Without knowing the scope and breadth of what we're talking about proposing, I think I would agree that way, taking it through a committee so we know how sweeping or encompassing the changes we're talking about. It probably would be a better way to go about it. Anybody else feel strongly about either direction? Councilor Anderson?
Well, I just feel strongly that we need to continue the discussion. Over the past few months or the last quarter, we've had a couple things come through TIF that were surprising. Using TIF for the facade program was something that sort of came out of left field. And I think that we need to take a look at what we're going to be using TIF for and make sure that we narrow those circumstances. I've always believed that they should be extraordinary circumstances, and now I'm not seeing that in some cases. And I think that this discussion needs to continue, whether it's at a committee or, our regular meetings or however. As long as that discussion continues, we can make some advancements in it.
Does anybody know, do we truly have a policy by the council on TIFs? Is that something maybe that the direction you're going, Councilor Jameson?
Well, there's certainly an ordinance, and there's certainly a state law that outlines our abilities. For me personally, it was a part of the application process, which is different than the ordinance. But I'm okay with doing it at land use as long as the chair is and willing, and that's just fine. Absolutely.
We'll get it on the Land Use Committee agenda then. It sounds like that's the direction you're going to go. So we'll just get that scheduled for this month yet, or what do you have going, Councilor Rolfing?
Councilor Jameson, are you ready to present that this month then? I think we could probably squeeze that in this month, so that would be good. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we'll get it on this month's agenda. Perfect. Any other new business? We do not have a fiscal committee meeting after this. Our next meeting will be at 7 o'clock, so meeting adjourned until that time.